This morning, I'm speaking with Reverend Mariann Budde. Reverend Budde, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. It's good to be with you.
It is an absolute honor to speak with you. And for anyone that doesn't know Reverend Budde serves as the spiritual leader for the Episcopal congregations and schools in the District of Columbia and several Maryland counties. She is the first woman elected to this position, and she also serves as the chair and president of the Protestant Episcopal Cathedral Foundation, which oversees the ministries of the Washington National Cathedral and Cathedral Schools. Prior to her election in 2011, she was the parish priest of St. John's Episcopal Church in Minneapolis. Reverend Budde earned a bachelor's in history at the University of Rochester, graduating magna cum laude, and she earned her master's in divinity and doctor of ministry degrees from Virginia Theological Seminary. She's been widely published in books and journals, and she herself is the author of several books. I'll have the Amazon link beneath this video, so please go like and subscribe and check that out. While she's not working, she's often riding her bicycle, cooking dinner for friends, and visiting family. She and her husband, Paul, now have 2 adult sons, and they're now grandparents as well. Congratulations. I'll have her website as well, mariannbudde.com. That's what I know about you so far, but I just wanted to say again, welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for being willing to do an interview today.
Glad to be here.
And as an atheist, I just want to start. I don't often say this to people of faith, but I need to say it to you. You are a hero, an absolute hero to so many of us. And I just want to start by saying you brought us to tears and to constructive anger and to motivation and grief, as well as a renewed sense of purpose on behalf of the people in this country who are suffering so much under this administration. Thank you so much for speaking truth to power, as you did on January 21st. Thank you for speaking up for the vulnerable, for the voiceless, and the forgotten. You are one of the bravest people that I know. And your sermon on the President's Inauguration Day was nothing short of transformative for me, and I'm sure for countless others around the globe who needed to hear the truth spoken with strength and compassion. So thank you so much for speaking so courageously and speaking truth to power.
It means a lot for you to say that to me. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you. And I do want to start by just asking some questions. This will be a little bit of a different interview than the ones I usually do, but sure. I want to talk about first the LGBTQ plus community and other marginalized communities. It seems like we are beyond living in a cultural emergency. It's one that's inflicting long-term trauma on the LGBTQ plus community, on immigrants, on women, on children, on communities of color. And you made a powerful emotional plea for mercy on behalf of these groups. And many of us now find ourselves trying to do everything we can to be safe havens and to serve as sanctuaries of sorts amid the rising tide of all this hostility and fear. What is your message these days to those who are afraid, to especially the LGBTQ plus people watching their rights being eroded, to women watching patriarchy rise again with renewed cruelty, to people of color carrying generations of trauma, to the poor, to these undocumented families terrified of being torn apart, and even to people like me, to secular Americans who see a Christian nationalist movement gaining political ground and threatening our safety, our rights, and our dignity? And how do we, what message do we send to people who are in these positions, and how do we galvanize ourselves, where both communities of faith as well as communities of no faith can in some ways stand together when those people in power are working so aggressively to harm the people that we're trying to protect? I know it's a big question. Softball question to start.
that was a very big question. And I thank you for it. I feel that there is a need, as you said so well, for those of us who see the world differently than the way it is being portrayed through the lenses of the people in political power now, especially, and corporate power. That with those of us who see the world differently and see humanity in more generous and diverse and glorious terms, to hold on to each other really tightly and to do whatever we can to protect one another's dignity and to assure one another of each person's inherent God-given or universe-given, however you want to describe it. As a person of faith, I would go back to God, but you know what I'm saying, just this inherent dignity of every human being that is not negotiable, right? That's not something that it can be trampled on by other people, but it doesn't take it away. Nothing can take it away. And that is something that we strive to see in one another and honor. And again, from the perspective of the universe, this is a universe that is defined by diversity And so to trust that at the source of this universe is a love of diversity and a love of difference, and that we are called, summoned to be the kind of people that strives to see the good and the value of every human being. And so I would start there. You are of priceless value, even when, and especially when there are people who seem to have a lot of power who are trying to tell you otherwise. And the second is a call for radical self-care and communal support. We can't go through times like this alone. And it does call for broad coalitions of people of goodwill to be clear about certain values that are, for us, non-negotiable. Which is why I'm here as a Christian. I'm here to say all of those things to people with whom I share a common humanity and a desire for a more generous and expansive view of what it means to be in this country and a citizen of the world.
When you have conversations with people who are in these groups that we just talked about, what are some of the things you're hearing in terms of the pain and the anxiety?
Well, all the things you described. I serve in a denomination that has, didn't come easily, but for, the last 50, 60 years, have really come a long way in our understanding of human sexuality and of what it means to be not simply an inclusive church, because that makes it sound like somebody has the power to include and others and to exclude, right? But to say that we are a church or a community of welcome and of all, we're all in this together. So I am committed to protecting that space within our church. And then also, as you were saying, to be as supportive to those who are expressing real fear and uncertainty about their future. It's not a blanket thing. I live in Washington, D.C. It's not as if everyone of the LGBTQ community is feeling that way. There's actually, it's a broader, more representative community than at least in Washington, than might be supposed. But there's no doubt about the fact that it's not as safe, and it's certainly not as welcoming an environment than we've had in years past.
Yeah, and I want to come back to some of the things you said in a few minutes, but sort of moving to I think a somewhat related question. For some people, they wouldn't see it as related, but I have come to see it this way. I want to talk about racism, if I could, and ask your thoughts on this. It seems like we're living in a time when many people claim to love this country, but that their so-called patriotism is often used as a cover to create policies that marginalize and surveil and brutalize communities of color. And we see systems that are designed, in my opinion, to uphold white supremacy, which is still very active and alive, camouflaged behind flags and slogans and distorted scriptures, probably. And we live in a society that not only refuses to reckon with the racism that's woven into our national identity, but it often, in my opinion, and no offense by this, but it often baptizes it in religious language. And we are watching more and more people attempt, I would argue poorly and painfully, to cloak their blatant racism in the language of patriotism. How do we begin to name this for what it is and expose it, boldly, without apology, and help people who might not be consciously racist, but are still swept up in the rhetoric and the propaganda and the complicity of silence, for sure. And what does this mean for us to be committed to justice and dignity, whether we're inside the faith or out of it? And really, at this point, how are we going to dismantle the systems of white supremacy in our nation and even in our churches?
Another really, really big question.
I'm going for the easy questions today. But can I just add, it's shocking that the Bible addresses this stuff so much. Micah 6:8, he's shown you what is good, to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. You look at Zechariah 7:9, administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. And yet the racism just overrides it. It's really stunning.
Right. Well, a couple of things. I can speak definitively about the church. So I'll start there. It has always been a mixed bag. in the church, right? So, and the Bible is a complex collection of documents that were written over a span of thousands of years ago in a tribal society where slavery was a given. And so there's a lot of, as well as capital punishment and patriarchy. So, I mean, you've got all kinds of texts. If you want texts to justify prejudice, you'll find plenty of them in the scriptures of the Hebrew and the Christian texts. At the same time, you're going to hear this corrective voice that you quoted, often known as the prophetic literature, which has as a counterpoint to the prevailing society and often dares to speak on behalf of a God of justice or a God of love. And so that's the counterpoint that I find in the sacred texts, or they're sacred to me, which is also a reflection of our society and a history of our church. And so in this country, the founding churches of the colonies, including the church of which I lead, they were all steeped in a theology that justified chattel slavery, and that had to be justified in their mind, both by some of the texts in scripture and also by a mythology that people that were being enslaved and trafficked from Africa were in fact inferior, less than human, because it's really hard to enslave someone if you do not dehumanize them first. You have to make them less than you are, which allows you to justifies what you're doing. And that's just been a part of our history. And then there's also been these chapters or these waves of correctives where people have come in and really bumped up against that with an alternative vision that has on occasion both transformed the church and transformed the societies. So I think what we're experiencing right now is a classic backlash after progress that was made or attempted to be made in different eras. In this country, there's almost always a pretty fierce backlash from, and it takes on different names because it's really, it's pretty easy. It's not that easy in the US right now to be an unabashed white supremacist. You have to cloak it in other language. 100 years ago, it wasn't a problem, but it's a problem now. So you have to use other language to do that. Language so persuasive, by the way, that that the Trump campaign increased its support among the Black community. So I mean, it's pretty successful if you look at it from that lens. At the same time, you're absolutely right that the roots of the nationalist movement that we're seeing in Christianity has its roots in the white supremacist movement, and there is a pretty visceral attempt to claim, when you say to make America great again, it's pretty clear that that means to make America white again, and it's not white anymore in huge numbers. So what are we going to do about that? Well, first, we're going to get rid of a lot of people, right? And we're going to disenfranchise in the nicest possible way so it doesn't look like disenfranchising whole groups of people, and co-opt as many as we need to, right? I mean, well, how conscious all of that is, I don't know, but the impact is straightforward. And in terms of how we respond, Tim, we don't get to choose what era we're in. So this may be a time when the efforts to present an alternative vision or to push back against this one may not see a lot of fruit. Sometimes you go a decade or more of not a lot to show for it before something happens and a new movement is started. I'm hoping that's not the case, but I don't know. And so like you, I do what I can, make common cause with as many people as I can. And, it is totally incompatible with the teachings of Jesus, by the way, all of it, completely incompatible. And so there's just as a Christian, I have a really hard time accepting Christian nationalism as Christianity. If it is, it's a heresy. It's a distorted version that serves the purposes of a group that is claiming to hold or wanting as much power as possible.
Yeah. Can I ask, do you feel any personal extra burden as a white person with a platform to try your best to work
Mhm.
even harder, like almost as if it were to make amends or to call us to amends, because in some ways we have, I went to school, for example, to be a pastor. I was a Christian for 40 years. I went to school to be a pastor and a missionary and a Bible translator.
Mm.
And, it's a very different question in one sense. What I'm doing on my channel is in a sense making amends for some of what I did, but more in a broad cultural sense that all white people, I think, need to admit that we have a sense of saying, if we're silent in this, even if we're not doing anything to cause the racism or speak in a racist way, if we don't fight against it, our complicity is speaking volumes,
Mhm. I think that's obviously the silence of the silence is usually, or the lack of action is often what perpetuates evil more than as much as the active pursuit of it. I would say, what would I say about that? Yeah, do I feel it? Absolutely. But and keep in mind that I serve a very multiracial diocese, right? So we have a lot of Black churches. We have a lot of people coming from all over the world, a lot of immigrants from Central and South America, from the islands, from different parts of Africa, from Europe. And so I don't have the privilege of like staying in my in my whiteness. I mean, I have to be in relationship with a lot of people. I also think privilege is something that is have to be careful about, because privilege takes many forms. And so there is certainly white privilege, but there are also other privileges of education and access to education, access to media, access. So there are, I feel I have to be cognizant of that. But to answer your question, I do feel that. And to uncover in our history, the history of our diocese, the systemic ways that we profited from slavery, we profited from redlining and the Jim Crow era, all of those things that we just need to say, yeah. So,
Mm.
yeah.
It's it's amazing when you really wrap your mind around it and you think to yourself, uh, what a horrible, crazy time we live in, but also what a time to potentially be a culture changer. When I was a Christian, I did Bible quizzing for many years, where you memorize huge chunks, entire books of the Bible. And one of the books that we memorized one year was the book of Esther. And
Wow.
it always stood out to me that the story where Mordecai
Yep.
says to Esther, "What if you're here for such a time as this?" And very,
This.
very big doors swing on very small hinges, and it's a lot
Mhm.
of it's a lot of power or responsibility. It almost takes your breath away, thinking the seeds that we plant today could become the trees of shade for tomorrow's generations. In in that same sense, though, talking about the next generation, one of the other, this won't be a softball either, but another big topic that I want to ask you about is related Christian nationalism and authoritarianism. It seems like when we look at white supremacy, one of the things it's coming back to in some ways, philosophically or evolutionarily, is the idea that we're a tribal people. And, if we could look back 100,000 years to ancient humanity,
Mhm.
we were fighting each other for everything, for
Mhm.
space and food and everything. But that tribalism comes out in so many ways. And one of them, of course, is the color of our skin. But
Mhm.
it seems like that's coming out. The tool to achieve some of that is Christian nationalism vis-a-vis authoritarianism. In this case, many people are expressing alarm, at least in the communities that I talk to, alarm that Christian nationalism is coming and is in many ways here. How can people of faith, number one, distinguish between their genuine conviction, like this is what I believe, without it turning into a coercive theology? And is there a path forward for helping Christians that honestly believe and want to believe, they have no doubts that their worldview is correct and they want to continue in that, but to understand that elevating one religion into law and governance does betray democratic principles, and I would argue in some ways the teachings of Jesus himself. But there are Christians who probably feel left behind culturally because they're against homosexuality, and so they feel like the normalization of that kind of polarized things, and now they feel like they're left out of the, like they want the center stage of, like, we want to dominate this conversation, and they're turning, it seems, to Christian nationalism as a form of identity or security. And do you agree with that dynamic? But do you also believe it's possible to reverse that trend so that that there's a hope that that love and mutual respect can still win in the public square? And how can people of faith defend their faith in a sense if they want to, but also defend pluralism and democracy. And do you think Christianity does have a path forward to be a force for inclusion, rather than a force of cultural dominance?
Well, let me begin with that last question, because that's where I live my life, right? I live my life, always have. Though I also, I came to faith in a much more theologically narrow worldview. And I'm not sorry for that experience, because it gave me a life of genuine faith. But as I bumped up against it as a teenager, I realized that there were assumptions that I simply couldn't share. And one of them was the narrowness of the path to what was described to me as eternal salvation, which I really didn't know what that meant either, but that sense of like, we're on the path and everyone else needs to get on this path or they are forever doomed. And, I didn't argue with people, because I loved them and they loved me, genuinely loved me. But I just, even at 17, is like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so I eventually moved away from that church.
You're referring to the doctrine of hell there?
Doctrine of hell, the doctrine of, Jesus is the only way to salvation, and
Gotcha.
that certain, and not only that, but certain expressions of Christianity are the true way, as opposed to even the very broad expression of Christianity that we find nationally and globally. So all of those things, I just couldn't accept. And so the further I've gotten, I'm 65 now, so that was a long time ago. And all that's happened to me in my years since is that I have become more persuaded that my job is not to imagine that Christianity is the path through which God, the only path through which the person or the being that I name as God, that's the only way that this being is deemed to be in relationship with us. It's just not my experience. It's not my observation. And it doesn't make any sense to me. I could be wrong. It doesn't really matter if I'm right or wrong. I'm just clear that that's where I stand.
Right.
So I believe that if Christianity is going to have a place in this world, it needs to do so in a spirit of humility and a focus on the common good, the good of all people, which doesn't mean that there aren't theological convictions that separate Christians. There are, but that doesn't mean that we can then go and create a society that benefits only us, right? Any more than I would want that for any other world religion, right? That would be my litmus test of a true religion, is if I can be comfortable in the presence of people who don't share it and still be true to my faith. Because if I need you to conform to my faith for my faith to be authentic, that means I don't have a lot of confidence in my faith, right? So I'm trying to focus on what gives me hope for that. So I would say that's, for me, that's the path. Now, that's not I don't know if that's a majority view, a minority view. I have actually no idea. Right now, it's not the politically ascendant view, and that's just simply because of the way the political power of this country has so shifted. But that's how I live my life, and those are if you were to come to any of our churches, that would be the message you would receive from most of them, if not all. So,
would you agree that religion in general, and sometimes Christianity, can just be another form of tribalism, where it's just in group, out group? You're bad and I'm good, and until you cross the bridge and join my side, you're my enemy. Do you think that's
sure. I mean, there's no guarantee that when one joins a faith that maturity comes along with it, right? And so tribalism is a form of human community. It's not in and of itself bad, except when it becomes so exclusive that our survival depends on the destruction of another tribe. And we all kind of start there, evolutionarily speaking, and certainly in our own development. And part of the task of growing and maturing, both as a human being, and I would argue in spiritual awareness, is to let more and more of that go, and to see ourselves as not one through coercion, but through just inherent humanity with others in the universe, right? It's just our stance. So I believe that's true. Is it the predominant view of any religion? No, but you see practitioners in all of them and they find common cause with each other. So you have Martin Luther King finding his greatest inspiration from Gandhi, and you have Thich Nhat Hanh and the Dalai Lama and Bishop Tutu. They're all really good friends, right? So I mean, there's just all this sense of like we are working toward Abraham Joshua Heschel walking alongside the civil rights movement. I mean, these are all just people who are saying we are practicing our faith in the ways that we feel called, but we are joining as one for the good of all humanity. And that's, for me, speaking for myself, the ultimate expression of faithfulness, the ultimate expression. So, yeah.
If I could just add, one of the things that's interesting is that I think when people leave Christianity, such as I did 5 years ago, I left Christianity at the end of 2019, but you do end up finding there's the community, the sense of community is very different.
Mm-hmm.
And yet in some ways it is still the same. And you'd think, well, now that we're free of all these rigid walls and these doctrines, surely there's so much more freedom in our community. And yet you do find atheists that will separate over minutia, and probably even case in point today, there are people who will be offended that I'm speaking with a reverend of an Episcopal church, and they'll think it was, not the right choice for a deconversion channel. I would strongly disagree, of course, but it is interesting how tribalism is just part of our nature.
Yeah, we're human, right? And there are certain aspects of humanity that are evolutionarily what we share with the rest of the mammalian, all the different species, right? And so that is that is part of who we are. And it isn't, and it isn't necessarily the seeds of evil. And in some ways it's necessary for our survival. And there is a higher, I don't want to say higher in terms of like morally superior, but there are other aspects of our survival that actually require a greater understanding of empathy and compassion and even self-sacrifice, right? That I will sacrifice some of my own good so that someone else can thrive. And that may be, for me in the short term, to my detriment, but in the long term, necessary, or even, and certainly beneficial for the greater good. And that is also part of our humanity. That's in us too. And it can be an expression of love. It isn't necessarily, you aren't necessarily a victim when you do that, when you give up your life, or you give up something of your life for the sake of someone else. And those are the times when I think we're kind of most proud to be human, right? And we see that in ourselves and or in another person. It's like, wow, that. But that's not right now, those are not ascendant values in our society. And so we're like I said, we're dealing with a reaction that has its roots in a lot of things that I'm not an expert in. So it's always dangerous for me to have opinions about them, but you named some of them, just economic dislocation, fear of the other, fear of change, fear of norms that seemed fixed, but are not fixed. Just the confusion of all of that, modernity, and all of its the things that are beyond our control. I mean, there's a lot up against the human species right now, and we're not always at our best in response to it. I try to have some compassion and understanding, trying not to judge too harshly, even though, as my scripture says, people by their fruits, and so I try to say, okay, let's see how, not so much what people say, but how do they act, and how do I act, right?
Yeah, and I love how you brought that out in your January 21st sermon about, if it's not enough to pray, you have to have the actions.
Yeah.
It's amazing too, just thinking, I'm a father of 4 small children, and it's amazing too to think about just the responsibility, in my opinion, to leave the planet better than we found it, and to give people just a fighting chance. And it's amazing. Sometimes in these darkest days, it does feel like, you really you get down for a while, you get depressed, you feel so much anxiety, you feel almost like it's not even worth the fight. But then you kind of dust yourself off and lick your wounds, and you kind of figure out, all right, well, I know I can't change it all, and I can't change it all soon. And even if I could change it all, I can't change anything quick, but I can do what I can. And that's definitely the goal. I do want to ask, again, all these are kind of quasi-related, and I apologize. I'm known for asking questions that kind of go on a few sentences, but I like to make sure that my context is clear. I
Yep.
want to talk about despair and division.
Uh,
Many of us are scared, not just of this administration, but of the cultural unraveling of empathy, of truth, of basic human decency in our society. And it feels like we're losing the language to even begin to process the scale of what's being eroded. And the damage feels generational. Everything from scientific stuff like climate denial to the gutting of civil rights to the assault on truth itself and the spread of violence as if it's normalized political discourse. How do you and how do we, people of faith and non-faith, how do we not collapse beneath the weight of that despair? And what do you say to those of us who feel like the moral fabric, not necessarily from a religious perspective, but just the moral fabric of our nation is being shredded faster, much faster than we can repair it? And how do we look, beyond even politics to the journey of our culture where we reclaim our humanity? For a lot of secular and atheist people, it's about humanism. That's sort of closest
mm,
we're going to come to an ism. But we're trying to reclaim our humanity, and it seems like for so many of the aspects of our administration and of our society as a whole, we're losing our basic civility. And maybe one of the hardest questions of all on this is, what does it look like to hold space for the appropriate anger at all this injustice, but also trying, perhaps sometimes in vain, but trying to find a way to love and to keep the lines of communication open with people around us, sometimes even our family and friends, they've completely lost our trust, our respect, and our sense of shared reality. Like what you're living in a different world. Like what in the world has just happened? You're trying to flip the tables and say that, not like Jesus, flip the tables of reality and say that this new reality is actually what's been real the whole time. And you don't even know where to start. It's like I'm in utter shock. How do
right.
you deal with that? How do we deal with that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, going back to your original words about despair, I think we'd have to be made of stone not to feel all the things that you said, right? And so grief and lament and finding ways to hold the pain is essential for our just to acknowledging reality, right? It would be worrisome if all of these things were to be happening and we didn't feel it, right? And so, and sometimes it really washes over. I mean, it does for me too. And so, and I have some practices, and I do believe ultimately that hope is a practice as well as a feeling that I might have, but that my feelings aren't necessarily aren't necessarily what guide me all the time. I may choose to have hope even if I don't feel hopeful, for example, right? But that doesn't mean I'm discounting how I feel, which is really sad or scared, despairing about the future and my ability to make a positive impact. So I just want to say that doesn't, it's just part of the experience. And you asked something about the rightful place of anger. And I think anger, again, is a perfectly appropriate natural response. Anger is a very cleansing emotion. It energizes and it galvanizes. It can also be like despair. It can overtake us, and it can, so I personally have to be careful with anger, so that it does not cause the same kind of damage that I'm angry about, right? So not to become what I hate. I think Gandhi said that. You don't want to become that which you are protesting against. And so that's a self-regulation issue. And each of us have a different threshold. So, but that requires our attention, both to acknowledge that anger is an appropriate response, but that we have some responsibility about how we express it, right? And violence is always a possibility with anger. And so to be careful, violent speech, violent deeds. In terms of love and dignity and staying in relationship, I feel, for me personally, that's what I'm committed to doing. And so choosing to actively resist within myself what some have called the culture of contempt, which normalizes contemptuous speech. and normalizes the treatment of people who see the world differently as being illegitimately human for holding those positions. And so, so I am doing my best to monitor and regulate how I respond so that I always respond with dignity, even if my dignity is being trampled on, so that that person or that institution or whatever isn't pulling me down with them, but that I'm holding on to what I can protect within myself. It's a little different when somebody else's dignity is being trampled on and I'm working to speak out or to protect them. Then I feel like I have a little bit more latitude to say, hey, you know, maybe that's the mom in me, like, that is just not okay, right? You know, I'm sorry, but that is not okay. And to be more direct about that. And love, you know, that's one of the reasons why I am a Christian, is I feel like Jesus, one of the things that he exemplified for us is love to the end. You know, time and time again, at the end, he could have chosen any number of paths, but he didn't. He didn't fight the evil that was overwhelming him. He surrendered to it on some level in a way that you and I may not want to do, but it is a sense of, I'm not going to fight power with power, or at least not this kind of power. I'm going to trust in a different kind of power. Maybe that's the other thing I would say, is that I'm not sure there's going to be any going back, Tim. I don't know that we're going to go back to what we had before, because so much is being dismantled, and frankly, maybe we don't want to go back completely, because where we were before got us to where we are now. And so maybe there needs to be a new way. And I don't know what that is, but I want to be on the other side of this nightmare, to be part of the building, right? And there's a very clear strategy here to destroy as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and then to rebuild it in a new image. And I want to be present to all of it, to protect as much as I can, and then also to be actively engaged in the rebuilding, so that it is good for as many people as possible. But I don't know what that looks like yet.
It feels like when this all started happening, especially when the original vote happened in November, one of the thoughts that came across my mind was instantly, not that I said this to anybody directly, but just collectively to the country, I'll never forgive you all for what you've done.
Mm-hmm.
You have done something that is truly unpardonable. And yet, in the sense of trying to keep the lines of communication open, you almost have to toe the line and find some way to say, I will never forgive you, but I will find a way to forgive you if I can.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, you know, to protect those, you know, the dignity of people who are being oppressed, it's a hard path to balance. And I don't have obviously the impetus of, I have to forgive or else God won't forgive me in the afterlife, but I still feel the burden, especially as a Christian of 40 years before, but I feel that burden of, like, forgiveness is going to have to happen at some point, especially in, at least on the one-on-one, you know, context of our friends and family who are wearing the red hats and have done this to us. And yet we have to still live with them. We have to still see them at Thanksgiving dinner and find a way to get along if we can. And it's a hard thing to deal with, honestly.
It's very hard. And forgiveness is a mystery. It's a choice. And it's also a freedom for ourselves, right? It's a way to say, I'm not going to live with, I'm going to free myself from the burden of how I am feeling toward this other person. I don't believe that as a Christian, I need to forgive so that God will forgive me in the afterlife. I don't see it that way. I think it's more of a, it's an expression of love. I think we all stand in need of forgiveness. We all are capable of doing and saying things that are harmful to others, certainly to ourselves and to this world. We probably are in need of more forgiveness than any of us realize. At the same time, we become larger inside when we can genuinely forgive another person, but there's nothing to be gained by pretending to forgive, right? Sometimes the best I can do is to say, I'm not being very forgiving right now, but I know there is a spirit of forgiveness in the universe, and I'm going to let that take over, because right now I'm just mad and hurt and furious actually at what is happening. And you're a dad, right? How old is your oldest kid?
10. 4 kids, 10 and under.
Okay, well,
It's a busy place.
Yeah, I should say, well, our sons are in their 30s now, but when our younger son went to football camp for the first time as a sophomore in high school, an away camp, and the way, and he like on the very first play of camp, he jumped for a catch and fell and broke his ankle. And the way he was treated by his coaches there. And then when they realized that it wasn't a sprain that he could walk off, but that he really broke it, I mean, badly broke it and they just abandoned him, right? They just left him there. And it took me a long time to forgive that man, right? I mean, and my son would have walked on hot coals for him, and he just adored this man, right? He would have done anything for this coach. And I just remember, like, it was just a visceral experience, like as a mother watching what you did to my son who trusted you and loved you. And I mean, I just remember, and it took me a long time to let that go. And I don't know that I fully did until I realized that our son had really moved on, like he was okay, right? It was definitely a marking event in his life, and it changed the course of his high school years. But I remember just like, oh man, this is not. So forgiveness for me isn't an abstract thing, like, oh yeah, I forgive you. No, it's like, I can look at you and no longer harbor, ill will against you for what you have done, right? And that's the kind of forgiveness I think you're talking about. You're seeing people are doing real harm to people. Some of it naively, some of it willfully, some of it with absolute glee. And that is really hard to forgive, right? So we have a job ahead of us.
Yeah, especially when it gets to the level of being just existentially disturbing. It's
right. It's just horrible. I mean, like this poor man who's been sent by mistake to a prison in El Salvador, and they're like, oh well, sorry. I mean, just like, really, that's your response. So I hear that. Now, does that absolve me as a human being, and certainly as a Christian, from the call to forgive? No, it doesn't, but it does acknowledge it's really hard, and I don't have to, it doesn't absolve responsibility. I think that's the thing. I might be able to forgive, but I can't necessarily spare you the consequences of what you've done. And it's a tough one.
Yeah, I appreciate your insights on that one. My next question is going to be a bit of a theoretical, but maybe a little bit, it's still deep, but maybe a little bit easier to think through and have fun with. If Jesus were here today, many of us are painfully aware that much of American Christendom now supports, sometimes directly and aggressively supports, Donald Trump, someone who seems to embody the exact opposite of the Beatitudes. He's celebrated in some ways more than someone who actually lives out a life of compassion and mercy and justice like Jesus preached. And we find ourselves, I think, asking, how can so many people who claim to follow Jesus also stand with a leader who openly tramples the very people that Christ prioritized, like the poor, the marginalized, the outcast? So, couple questions. If Jesus were walking among us today, probably healing the sick, feeding the hungry, welcoming the immigrants, challenging the powerful, flipping the tables, what do you think he would say right now about what's happening in our country? And as a follow-up to that, do you think Jesus would be embraced by Trump's political and religious supporters, or would they potentially and even literally crucify him a second time?
As bad as our society is now, it's not as oppressive as the society in which Jesus lived when he walked the earth, right? So we pretty much know what Jesus would do if he were here today. He would gather a few people around him to mentor and to teach, to start a movement. He would gather people, he would feed, and he would heal, and he would teach, and he would empower. He would go to the centers of political and religious power and make his stand there. My sense is he was a radical pacifist, so he would not encourage armed violence of any kind. He did not demonize those who caused him harm. He recognized that the people closest to him, one of his closest disciples, would be his betrayer. And so all of them would flee him. So he knows of which we are made, right? So all of those things are true. So he would have harsh things to say, not simply to the politicians, but to the religious leaders. And I'm sure he'd had some hard things to say to me too, you know. So I'm not separating myself from those in religious authority that for who his words are less than complimentary, right? So all of those things. But I think he would be the kind of person that if we were to see him, we would say, wow, if divine love were to take human form, I think this is what it would look like. So I think we'd all be kind of blown away. No doubt that we would crucify him again, because that's what we do. But I'm not sure where I would be on that. I mean, I would like to believe I would be among the faithful, but you know, I'm not going to assume anything about where I stand in that, how he sees me in that way. Yeah, it's a question that we often ask, right? What would Jesus do? How would we respond? What would if he walked the earth? Would we recognize him? Yeah, those are really all very poignant questions. He also died very young. You know, he died a young man, you know, half my age. So there's a firebrand element of Jesus that you don't see, say, in like a Moses or anyone who lived, you know, the Muhammad, people who lived a long time, right? He had that kind of urgency. He had 3 years, maybe, of public ministry. So there's a kind of urgency about him. So I'm guessing he'd be young, you know, he'd be out there, probably more radical than I'd be comfortable with, for heaven's sakes. And so, you know, it's a good reminder for me, right?
Good answer. Good answer. So I did want to ask, in terms of bringing us towards a wrap up, to my community, the deconstructing and deconverting community, our journey often took us on a path that's different, a path we didn't expect, where we noticed that the worldview and beliefs that we adhered to were overflowing with toxicity. And it's sort of a cliche that I like to go to, that when you believe monstrous thoughts long enough, they turn you into a bit of a monster. And I think you probably could relate to that from your story of the earlier, you know, faith group you were with, and when you shifted your beliefs. To a lot of us, it feels like our loved ones and many others around us have been indoctrinated into conspiracy theories and authoritarianism and even theological ideologies that are teaching them truly monstrous ideas, such as the idea that empathy is a sin. Have you heard that one?
Mm-hmm.
And that making America great requires dehumanizing our neighbors. How do you respond to believers specifically who claim that their faith compels them to oppose the LGBTQ plus community or to remove immigrant protections? And what do you say to non-believers who see the church often, not always, but often, aligning with political cruelty, and we're concluding that compassion and even the power of the gospel to transform lives, we thought it was at the core, but it doesn't appear to be there. And we are asking ourselves, how can a man who publicly mocks the disabled, who scapegoats immigrants, and sows division, how can he be seen by Christians as God's chosen leader? And I think a lot of us would say Trump has never modeled humility or repentance or compassion, the very qualities that Jesus exalted. Why are so many churches willing to excuse and even praise those contradictions?
I listen carefully to the people who see in President Trump God's divine coronation, right? They rarely speak of Jesus when they do that. They speak of Cyrus. Do you remember Cyrus?
Yeah.
Cyrus was a king of Babylonia, or, you know, one of the foreign countries in which the people of Israel had gone into exile. Cyrus was not a Jew, but he allowed the Jews to go back and claim their homeland, and is praised in the book of the prophet Isaiah as God's instrument, even though he was not of the people of Israel. So they often say that Donald Trump is an instrument of God, and that is fulfilling God's purposes, even though he himself is not a Christian, or doesn't act as a Christian, doesn't follow the teachings of Jesus. I've heard that a lot. I also feel that for some, religion and politics have become so intrinsically mixed that it doesn't really matter what the president does or says. He is a religious figure for them in the broad sense of religion. I also feel that that's true of some of the people who are opposing him, that that's a religion too. Like they're religion-like qualities, even if it's not a, recognizable theological worldview. So it's not rational in that way. It's like that they've given their heart to this, and they believe, they talk about it as salvation. Now that's a pretty small section of the people who are part of the Trump administration's base. It's a pretty wide swath of people, but it's a significant part, and I don't understand it. I obviously don't accept it. It doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to be helpful to point out to people that they're stupid, right? That rarely works as a motivator. And people don't usually say, oh, thank you for pointing that out to me. I'll try to do better. So if I'm insulting to them, or if I question their intelligence, or if I question their beliefs, they've already shut me out. They've shut me down. So it may be accurate on some level, but I've lost any possibility of conversation. So I try to be respectful and curious, and to honor the dignity of another person, even if I find their beliefs abhorrent. But that doesn't mean that I don't find their beliefs abhorrent, right? I simply try to remember that underneath those beliefs, as the criminal justice reformer Brian Stevenson says, we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. We are all more than the worst thing that we believe. None of us are infallible in our beliefs, and so just trying to have enough humility inside me that I can stay in some kind of relationship. It may not be a good relationship, but it may be the best I can do. So that's what I would say in terms of how I try to engage other Christians while being very clear about who I am and where I root my convictions, not just because I happen to think they're right, even though I do, but where they are rooted in my understanding of our faith tradition, right? And to be honest about the fact that I hold some beliefs that are not particularly consistent with our faith tradition, but I hold them anyway, right? So I'm not that much different in some ways than the people I'm criticizing. In terms of the people who've been harmed by faith, I am well aware of the damage done, and I grieve it, and I'm ashamed of it. And I am part of a lot of movements to try and make repair and reparations for harms done. I often don't get a chance to say that to people who have left the church. I'm often more in relationship with people who are wounded and traumatized, but choose to remain in the church because of their loyalty or their sense of separating their experience of connection to the mystery we call God and the behavior of people who are bound to disappoint you. So, but I understand it. And I understand that there is a point where any one of us might say, yeah, I don't believe anymore. I don't have any sense of whatever they're talking about. And most of the language of theology is symbolic, but whatever that's pointing to, I just don't believe it. I don't see it. I don't feel it. And holding all those things as if I did, or when I thought I did, was harmful to me. I get all that. I've never imagined that the church had all of the answers. And sometimes we do our most damage when we think we do. So.
I would definitely ditto and echo that. I did not, fortunately, get vocal about when I was a Christian about my anti-homosexual stance, but I was certainly in groups that preached that very aggressively, and I certainly thought those thoughts in my head, and it was quite if I can borrow the term repentance, it was quite a time of repentance for me when I moved on from that worldview to say, wow, like what a monster I have been, becoming. And
right.
I'm sorry.
One more thing I'll say that one of the people I really admire, Barbara Brown Taylor, said, that if she had to choose between her faith and another human being, she would always choose another human being, right? Which I think is the ultimate expression of Christianity, right? If it's a doctrine or if it's a thing and there's a human being standing in front of me, I'm going to choose the human being. And I think I think that's why the sin of empathy has become an important catchphrase, because that's dangerous to people who are trying to hold a group of people to a strict worldview, right? You can't do that. You can't choose the humanity. But that's how minds have changed. I mean, the only reason our church has changed its position on LGBTQ plus people is because we keep on baptizing them as babies, right? And they grow up and we love them. And then they come out to us and it's like, oh, well, I guess it must be okay with God because you are certainly okay with God, right? There's no doubt about that. So you know what I'm saying? Like that's how people change, not because they have an idea.
It's beautiful. It's amazing when you do that, make that shift and you prioritize people over doctrine. It's an amazing journey. I do want to maybe ask for a wrap up just to say, for those of us, again, in and outside of the faith communities, what's the call to action in your mind here? How can people, regardless of what they believe about religious things, what can we be doing? What should we be doing? And, what are your priorities for making a change at this point?
Right. Well, everybody has their own lane, their own, wherever they are, and what I'm doing may not be at all what other people are called to. So I think in some ways we all have to discern where we are in life, what our spheres of influence are, where our points of connection are. Are there points of connection we need to be making that we're not making now? I mean, there's an individual kind of soul searching that we all need to do. And then we have to, I would just say the other thing that I'm looking to is how can I find common cause with as many people as possible? Because what we're up against is way bigger than any one person or any one group of people can effectively address. And then I guess the third thing I would say, again, this is just me, but maybe it applies to others. If it's helpful, great. If it's not, don't worry about it. But just be open to surprises, like things, there is whatever you want to call it, there is a force of resilience and goodness in the universe that we tap into pretty regularly. And so to find ways to tap into that, however it comes to you, and trust that that's to the good, right?
Beautifully said. And it's funny. I am, again, I'm an atheist and I'm a nihilist. At the end of the day, I don't think any of this matters or never will or ever could, but you can't live there. And I live in a way that says, you have to make a difference. You have to make a strong difference. And if nothing else, for your own children, beautiful children, leave this planet better than you found it. But was there anything else you wanted to add before we wrapped up today?
No, I just want to thank you for letting me be in conversation with you. It's lovely to meet you.
Likewise, I'm so honored to meet with you. And I'm down here in Atlanta. If you and your husband are ever passing through, I would love to take you out to dinner. It would be an honor to shake your hand someday. But thank you so much. And I'll just wrap up by saying we've been speaking with Reverend Mariann Budde. I'll have some links beneath this video again if you want to go further and check out her great work. But thank you so much for your voice. Thank you again for speaking truth to power. You are a hero, and we appreciate your time and your story. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.